following is my conversation with Fergus Niland. Fergus is the creative director at Santini Cycling Wear. Santini has been making premium road cycling clothing since 1965 from their headquarters in Bergamo. They are the official supplier of Ironman. They also produce the cycling clothing, the official cycling clothing for the UCI, and they produce the yellow jersey for the Tour de France. Welcome, Fergus. I'm really happy to speak with you today. When I decided to start this podcast, it definitely, our conversations, our many conversations about the business of cycling and your curiosity and your take on cycling is definitely something that contributed to this project, and really happy to have you on today. So
happy you asked me why. I'm pleased you got this off the ground. There's no better person to do something like this. So yeah.
Thank you. So let's dive into it. I think we're going to give people a really interesting look at what a designer, creative, in the clothing industry with a deep experience, insider experience. You work with the Tour de France with ASO. You worked with RCS for years, the UCI, Ironman. So we've got a lot on our plate today. So let's get started. But what I wanted to talk about in particular was maybe you can talk a little bit about so people can have a little bit of background about you, how you got into writing, designing, and then into Santini. And then maybe after that, we can dive into some of the topics that I wanted to discuss specifically today.
Okay. So I guess my start in the industry, I went to art college. I was a painter. And I guess trying to make a long story short, left art college, was a pretty shit artist for a year or so. And then through family reasons, basically moved back to the west coast of Ireland from Dublin and ended up getting a job as an archaeological illustrator. So that kind of got me, you could say, first real job out of college. Anyway, fast forward a little bit, and that was great fun. You meet, I would say, even more peculiar people in the world of archaeology than you do in cycling. So anyway, they gave me a good basis when I started working for Santini. But the thing was, the economic crash came about 2008, that time frame in Ireland, the housing market crash. And anyway, got laid off, set up in 2008 my own agency, designing archaeological illustrations, technical plans, all that kind of stuff with a buddy. And that archaeology thing started to peter out. And at the same time, you could say, during and after college, I was racing bikes and racing triathlons. So that was a huge part of my life. This friend of mine, we were running, so racing all the time. Anyway, by virtue of the contacts I had through local clubs in the west of Ireland, I just basically started designing gear for clubs and made contact with distributors who were based in Ireland for various different brands. Giordano was the first Italian brand, and that guy was called Philip Cassidy. So Philip Cassidy really gave me my entry into the world of cycling, apparel, and the whole industry. A great guy, amazing bike racer, won the Ross. So anyway, was working with Philip. The point was the archaeology thing died out. But the cycling thing took over, and when we had the economic crash, everyone was on 3-day weeks or laid off. So everyone picked up bicycles or, got a pair of runners and went running or riding. And so basically that meant my second career after archaeology took off. And I was freelancing then for years, looking after my parents, so managing to basically freelance, make a good living, all that stuff, and be based on the west coast of Ireland. And anyway, after Philip, got to meet another guy called David McQuaid, and David was working for Santini as a distributor in Ireland. David's family in Ireland would be exceptionally, in the patchwork that is of Irish bike racing. The McQuaids are right there. His dad, Pat, was obviously the president of the UCI, etc. Anyway, through David, I got contact with the sisters, Monica and Paola, who, like I say, cut a long story short, offered me a job, but I had to move over to Bergamo. And at that point in my life, for family back home, I'd arranged things and said, listen, there was one parent left at that time, and my mother was capable at that point of looking after herself. And I said, I reckon it's a good opportunity. I'm going to move out to Bergamo. We'll figure it out, etc. And got in the plane, packed up a bag, got in the plane, and flew into Bergamo, and that was in 2012. And I've been there ever since.
I spoke with Juliet Elliot, the English YouTuber, influencer, rider, and you guys are similar in age. And she did something similar. She went and worked for Met back in 2012 as sort of a manager for or for marketing, and so she
Mhm.
kind of made that jump. She didn't make it. She just kind of lasted about a year. I think her husband was with her and they just didn't like it. They were in the kind of in the mountains. Was it hard for you at first to kind of integrate yourself?
Yeah, God, no, it's certainly there was the culture shock takes effect, but at the same time, kind of it's not the hardest country in the world to move over to. It's a family run business, so everything that goes with that, basically, you're exceptionally well looked after. And kind of, I mean, Italy is, you had to learn the language. I was working, I was freelancing with different Italian brands, so I was conversing via email in Italian. I was doing Italian courses at university to try and pick up the language, but obviously you move over, as you know, moving over to Torino is basically, it's a whole different world when you're actually there and you have to speak, and kind of all the various different conventions and cultural differences,
Sure.
et cetera, all those little quirks that you have to basically pick up as well. So yeah, it was by no means easy. I don't think it's ever easy for anybody that ever has to kind of, pack a bag and fly in a plane and kind of start a new life, kind of, but that's part of the fun as well, So
It is
yeah,
you have to have that spirit. And
pretty much.
I think
Yeah.
that being an expat, like we're fellow expats, and I spoke with Juliet about this as well. It's like being an expat is incredibly difficult at times, but the highs are highs, the lows can be low. But once you're in it, I don't think you want it any other way, right?
Yeah, definitely. Without kind of, a horrible cliche, but a common language was racing bikes that I had. So when I moved over, kind of got into a little team over here when we raced bikes. So kind of, in that way, that was kind of a social outlet and a way to integrate yourself really into the society here. I would have met other expats here that were here for purely business purposes. Actually, another Irish guy and his wife, and kind of they really weren't feeling it. It wasn't working out for them. And I think that's critical. You have to, I mean, you
Community. You
have to buy
have to have a
into it.
community.
Exactly. And kind of then on top of that, I would have, through work, I would have a huge passion for the history and culture of Italy anyway. And then obviously bike racing is a major part of that. And the manufacturing of bike apparel is a major part of that. So I didn't give up, let's put it that way.
Yeah, it's I think we similarly probably went through that kind of. You get the honeymoon, then there's a bit of a hangover, but if you're able to plow through, 3-4 years, it's pretty rewarding. So
That's,
yeah, so you've been in at Santini for 11 years now.
yep.
And so today there's a lot we could talk about, but I think I wanted to try and zero in on, I mean, we could literally sit here for hours and hours on different topics, but I wanted to zero in on language, communication language with regards to apparel.
Mm-hmm.
So we talked about maybe just kind of sticking around that. And so visually, but also within the marketing sense as well, because you have so much experience. So I guess let's just jump into it. So with clothing, as you know, I wrote in a recent blog about how there really has been an explosion in clothing brands due to, the relative ease of starting a brand. Not necessarily easy to be successful, but it is easy to start. So I guess the first question is when it comes to kind of using language around, clothing that you're seeing in general, people use a lot, a lot of brands use similar language. So
Yeah.
like how do these brands actually distinguish themselves in your experience?
Well, I mean, in terms of in terms of you, it's a question. I mean, there's different ways you could break that down. One is you would have to ask the other brands in terms of what they're, whoever they are, whether or not they truly understand what they're talking about. Because I would have seen over the course of over the 11 years, now obviously Santini private label stuff for other brands. So I mean, you mentioned there about it's easier, or the access to get into making cycling gear was easier. But trust me, I've seen a lot of people come and go, and it didn't work out for them. So kind of for the ones that were successful, there were 10 that weren't. And I think probably feeding into your question, part and parcel of that was just a complete lack of understanding of the technical side, the technical aspects of what's involved, and probably then the communication of that to the consumer. The interesting thing, I guess, is that even still nowadays, it has improved still, but I was still, even the cycling press and the general consumer who buys cycling apparel, you can't blame the consumer, but the information that's put out there isn't fantastically accurate or detailed at times. So I think trying to get that correct is very important. And then obviously from the technical side, you're talking about fabrics. So the details have to come essentially from the suppliers, and they have to be transparent, and they have to be forthright with, with all that information. And then I suppose at that point, the message is up to the brand. The message is up how they want to spin or how they want to transmit those details to the public. But I mean, it's performance apparel. Okay, so performance apparel is kind of critical. There's lots of different aspects there that kind of make it work, you could say. But certainly from the point of view of, kind of there's different messages, but it's all performance apparel. It has to make, if you ride a bike, it's very hard. It's exceptionally hard exertion on your body. So therefore the apparel has to work. So primarily, I guess, explaining that to the public is important.
So that's the baseline, is sort of these technical aspects, which it sounds to me like are relatively available to most brands, right? So what, as a designer, because I know you both do, the image, you do the designs, but you also do product development. So when it comes to like developing products, how do you guys then try and how do you guys are you guys able to distinguish yourselves when it comes to, I don't know, is it materials? Is it concepts? Maybe can you talk to that a bit?
I think that certainly, so we'll go back to materials again. Certain things, I mean, over the last decade, there's been certain advances, but there's not been, quantum leaps in terms of technology. There's a few things that are going to be driven now, and they're more related to what I certainly, kind of everyone's been far more aware of, kind of the push towards eco-sustainability. So there's going to be certain changes at a political level that will be made that will force the manufacturers, that will force those suppliers to find solutions for fabrics that previously they didn't have to. So from that point of view, yes, as a brand, you have to pick up on that. You have to be very aware. And as a designer, I would feel it's a responsibility to actually drive that as well. So kind of to make certain that you are at the forefront, because cycling in certain ways, it's a tiny component of the outdoor world in general, in terms of what we constitute. And at times we don't do enough maybe to push that aspect. And I think certainly kind of that's going to be very important to communicate going forward into the future. Then I guess you look at certainly when I'm putting products together, yes, a lot of it can be based on, we find a beautiful fabric that functions incredibly efficiently, and we think we can make a product. We think we see a potentially a need for a product that perhaps hasn't existed. It doesn't have to be exceptionally complicated. It can just be quite an elegant, simple solution to something that hasn't been done before. It could be something that's just simply, it looks slightly different. It looks appealing. It could be something along those lines, and we try and drive that. But quite often the drive behind what I try to put into products is everything is, like I say, it's going back to this point. It's made for people that ride bikes. You have to have an understanding of that, and kind of it's for however much people want to drive cycling in the direction where it becomes more fashion orientated. Certainly, I've got, part of my work in life is trying to do that. But at the other hand, you are dealing with, there's a responsibility. You have an individual that's on a bike. You could be riding up the side of a mountain. It could be temperature changes. They could be descending off the mountain. There could be all these different factors, physiological factors that you have to bear in mind. And you have a responsibility to create products that are able to deal with that and are able to, in a certain way, protect that individual, as you would if you went into the mountains, if you were climbing the side of a mountain, for example, a mountaineering. So from that point of view, you have to be very aware of how technical your product is. And I guess, especially now, how sexy it looks. And that's kind of the balance you have to put together.
Well, and I know that this kind of fashion sensibility has been something that has developed in the last 15 years. Maybe more prevalent, with certain brands bringing those elements. Are you seeing that accelerating? Is that something that's sort of mature now in your view?
I think, well, certainly it has. And like I say, you believe me, there's nothing wrong with it doing that, you know, kind of as a, you could say, being very critical of the going back 15 years, you know, kind of what road cycling especially had become was something that was quite not, let's just say, not very aesthetically appealing. And that was the world it existed in. And I think obviously, you know, kind of people, you know, made a decision that, you know, you don't have to, if you ride a road bike, you don't have to look like that. And so from my point of view, absolutely, any form of creativity that encourages people to ride, that is ultimately going to encourage people to ride bikes, is positive. So every brand that sets up, that wants to create apparel that enables that to happen, in my opinion, is a good thing. The more people riding bikes is the goal for everybody. I'm not certain going to say that it's matured, but I would like to think that, you know, cycling is a meritocratic endeavor, and that kind of everything comes back down to the fact that if you are riding bikes, it requires a certain degree of dedication to the fact, and kind of you have to then possibly get to a point where you search for products that are very technically, you know, how would I put it? They work, you know.
Sure, no,
That's what it comes down to. So yeah, you could go out and you could ride a bike. I always have the great quote, the Dancing in the Streets, Martha and the Vandellas, and he says it doesn't matter what you wear, just as long as you're there. Like, you know, I love that, and I love to think about cycling in those terms. Is you could ride your bike in whatever you wanted, but there will be a certain point where that won't work. So yes,
so,
you can
there,
design beautiful stuff, but at the same time, like I say, it has to work.
so there's a core of performance that is sort of the baseline. I think we keep coming back to this, that there's a core with regards to, we're talking about road cycling. Now there is, you know, some gravel. The gravel cycling has sort of, I guess we could say, expanded the reach of the road cyclist, of the road kind of people riding bikes. It has expanded, but it sounds like that this whole performance, the core of, you know, really functional garments to where people feel good on their bikes, is sort of the baseline. But then that this fashion element was able to bring new people into the sport, and probably also, you know, increase probably the amount of kind of the people that were existing to the sport. Maybe they moved more towards a fashion sensibility, but you're saying that they're not like that, they had one works with the other. So how does fashion, I guess, I don't know, it comes to mind, like there's some I don't know much about fashion, but I know that there is a kind of quiet luxury trend happening now. I'm just going to throw that out there. Do trends like this influence cycling apparel?
Well, I think there'll be, within the context of the marketplace, to be certain brands that will obviously follow kind of, they'll be much more led by the trends that are happening in the fashion world. There'll be other brands that will be more conservative. Santini would be one of those brands that would be more conservative. You know, our DNA and the basis is in the world of professional road racing, you know, kind of. But in terms of overriding trends, I think, like, going back to your point there about, you could say, what gravel is and what gravel has become. I think a lot of people who I know that are buying gravel bikes are just people who, quite honestly, are scared to ride their bikes on the road. So I mean, they're looking at it in a way where they're not really led by a decision. Like, there's obviously in that world, that culture, that thing of gravel, yeah, sure, there's people there that love the fact that it looks a certain way, and that's absolutely beautiful, because there are some incredibly interesting creative things happening. But again, there are other people that exist in that world who are just kind of normal, ordinary individuals who might ride a bike for a couple of hours on a Sunday, and they don't want to be around cars. Whether or not that consumer is fixated with the fact that they're wearing the most fashionable thing when they ride their bike, the answer is probably no. So you can't stretch things out so far that you leave that person behind. You know, you can't, and that's really, that is cycling in a nutshell. You know, it's like I say, it's a tiny universe, and you have to be very careful at times not to alienate people, because, like I say, the goal is to making certain everybody can ride bikes. I think, I mean, looking towards the future, I mean, kind of leading off that question in a slightly different direction, but, you know, you could kind of walk into a Patagonia or a North Face store, and you could probably come out, you know, if they sold chamois at the till, do you know, that type of thing? Or, you know, kind of, you could probably walk out of the store and have enough stuff to go and ride a gravel bike for an hour or so without having to even think about what cycling is, you know?
Sure.
So from that point of view, the world going forward is there will always be a core of road racing stuff, because it is exceptionally technical, and it exists, you know, kind of completely by itself. But then the larger landscape, definitely it's maturing and changing, and it is quite exciting to think about how it's going to be, for example, in 20 or 25 or 30 years time.
So when you think of cycling, this is something that doing this podcast, that one kind of common theme that just keeps coming up over and over and over again is how inclusive cycling is. That it's almost insular in a way that it's a community. And I've come to the conclusion that there's a few different reasons for that. One is that when people approach cycling, they want to be able to kind of speak the language quickly, to be able to be part of it, because it is a community. It's, you want to have like-minded people around. So that's when, the right bike, the right clothing, the right, not the right one, but just the one that maybe identifies you as a cyclist.
Sure.
In your experience, to have that community that you see, how does that affect, I guess, the way that you're designing clothing with that community aspect in mind? I'm assuming that with that, that there are certain rules that you do have to abide by, but to be able to kind of maybe push the boundaries of those rules, how does that affect your work?
Yeah, well, definitely, definitely. Sorry about that. If everyone heard that. Definitely, the idea of community is a word. It's like kind of like a buzzword that exists, kind of. And I guess go back to the thing about communication, trying to establish the fact that you have a community, and therefore the basis of your brand or the basis of the apparel was founded as a result of from the community is fine. Community, though, kind of it's a construct in the same way that any brand that wants to suggest that, or any brand that wants to kind of present the fact community is fine, but it's just as long as it doesn't get to the point where you start excluding other people because they don't fit into that community. I think certainly we are, like, I can only speak for Santini, but certainly a brand that is, you know, like I said, we go back to it. Road cycling is a community, and that's what it was in 1965 when everything started, and kind of what it is now in 2023. Certainly, the certain conventions you have to maybe, or certain things that have changed in a way where you want to, I look at inclusivity in terms of going back to this word of community, isn't necessarily trying to make someone believe that they have to dress a certain way. Okay, that's not it. To be involved in a community, you should just be able to wear whatever you want and go and ride bikes whatever you want, and hopefully never be, kind of castigated because you
Well,
don't
but
have.
there are some norms, for better or worse, that do sort of, there are some of these constructs around road cycling where, like there's the famous website, the rules, Villuminati, the rules, where, these are the rules of road cycling. I mean, I think it's just sort of ingrained in the DNA of road cycling, for better
But
or
that
worse,
changes. But that
for better
changes
or
over
worse.
time. But that has changed over time. And even that rule stuff is old now. Kind of, I'd say, kind of the stuff there that kind of really doesn't work anymore. I mean, it's driven by certain things, and I mean, kind of like, would anybody, at a certain point, you went back 30 years, kind of when Gianni Bugno was racing the bike, everyone wanted to look in Italy, wanted to look like Gianni Bugno, but kind of, but 30 years later, do you want to look like him now? Because he was the paradigm. It was sat within a specific social and cultural and historical context, and he was what absolutely you should look like when you ride a road bike. Now, if someone dressed up, it's a Roika, so kind of it's fancy dress. But definitely, going back to the point, there is absolutely 100% building community through riding bikes is a beautiful thing, but it has to be approached in a way where everyone needs to be accepted into that community, but not excluded through economic factors because you can't afford the expensive stuff, or you can't afford the new bike, or all that kind of stuff. That has to be something I think is, but maybe to touch on the communication and marketing point there, other brands maybe try to push that.
Right. And then that comes into an exclusivity discussion, which, is a whole nother conversation. But I guess let's jump over to, making a quality garment, like making a quality piece of kit. Kind of what can a typical, we'll call a good piece of kit. What are some of the parameters that you use, just to kind of give people a baseline on what that looks like?
I think that, well, I guess mean, kind of if you like, I mean, talking to if you were like I say a tailor making men's suits, or you kind of any experience within the world of fashion, or kind of at a production level at all, you could do something very simple. I mean, kind of if people wanted to walk into a store, if that was the case now, and kind of just literally get the jersey, get the product and turn it inside out and just look how it's finished, you know, kind of, is it equally, is there an attention to detail on the inside as there is on the outside? There'd be certain things, obviously, from a designer or from a creator's eye, you would pick up on in terms of the quality of a fabric, knowing how probably expensive that fabric was there a point that they, you know, what was the point in using that, what was the point of constructing the product in a certain way? There'd be certain passages through a production line where a product would go through where you would understand, okay, there's been a lot of work gone into this. Why? And does it mean anything other than just for an aesthetic kind of appeal? Or maybe there is a reason. Maybe it was constructed in a certain way where it was, you look at it and you go, holy cow, like they went to town on this one, like this is going to last forever, you know? So there'd be certain things possibly kind of that, you know, from, like I say, from that point of view, I would pick up on. I think that people instinctively, again, going back to this point, instinctively, you know, there's no one perfect piece of equipment that suits everybody. A lot of people who I would talk to now over the years kind of would simply say that they find a brand that produces stuff and it just fits them. And that's the reason why they stick with the brand. It fits well, you know? And
Sure.
ultimately, that's what it comes down to. Comfort is another cliche, but comfort is king. And kind of if people feel good and they can ride a bike for whatever, however long they want to without having to suffer as a consequence of the clothes they wear, then that's a successful product, you know?
Well, and that's another thing, like, comes to mind that, you know, you guys use, I don't know what the word is in English, it's models, like you use different types of models, and those are the standard models in terms of sizing and in terms of kind of the way that a garment fits. And Santini's known for having everything's based on world tour sizing. And that can sometimes be confusing, especially for Americans. But once you do get into that fit, so a customer will then kind of be kind of used to that fit, and then they're sort of, at that point, you have some loyalty moving forward. So is that kind of what you meant by that?
I think that's kind of, I think going back in Santini, yeah, we make stuff for like world tour teams. So obviously, right, kind of from the point of view of making that type of product, yeah, we have lots of experience there, and we have lots of products within our product ranges that correspond to that. However, I guess that I certainly just wouldn't say that we don't base the rest of our product line on the basis of how a world tour rider, their physiology. So kind of, we have lots of products that are based on normal individuals, okay? But at the same time, the idea of, like you say, you have to be, it keeps going back to this point about trying being the point of inclusion is you have to be aware of perhaps who rides bikes and what they need, and kind of when someone rides a bike, you know, within 12 months they could be 15 or 20 kilos lighter. So from that point of view, there has to be something for them that they can use to start with, and then obviously if they want to progress, something they can move into later on. So yeah, I mean, kind of, you have to be aware of all different types of individuals. Yeah.
So you guys do have like different models based on, so the more race cut will have kind of that world tour cut, and then you guys have a more classic, or, you know.
Yeah, the world tour level products that we produce for the teams are of a sizing and of a fit that we wouldn't be readily available to the public, because they're so incredibly race fit, you know. Okay. That lots of amateurs individuals who, yeah, you could say that they have the body of a world tour rider, but they might not have a team behind them that can buy them, you know, 10 pairs of bib shorts or whatever, 10 jerseys and all that kind of good stuff. So at the same time, they're going to need something that is going to be comfortable and usable over and over again. So no, absolutely, kind of, we don't base everything on kind of world tour riders, no, kind of on how that fits those guys. We have a portion of our product line that is based on that, but then there are other divisions within our product lines that are based on different physical shapes, different bodies. Yeah.
So how does the interaction with the world tour teams influence the products?
I think that perhaps the misconception a lot of people might have is that World Tour gear is the pinnacle of design and the pinnacle of the technological end and the pinnacle of, you know, kind of the be all and end all of cycling apparel. And it really in a lot of ways, in some cases it is, but in a lot of cases it's not. The way I explain this to people is that they're like soldiers going to war, so the thing has to work. And the other aspect obviously is they're moving billboards, so kind of the stuff has to print as well. So that from a designer, from a product guy's point of view, is kind of, you have two huge obstacles there you have to overcome when you're putting stuff together. We would create stuff that is, yes, absolutely, things that are targeted to make, let's just say, riders, protect riders or make them more efficient when they ride a bike. There's products that exist like that. And those technical aspects do filter down into the commercial market. But going back, I say for me, when I look at the pro gear stuff, it's really utilitarian. Has to be incredibly robust. It has to work. A lot of it isn't the most beautiful fabrics. A lot of it is just kind of the stuff that really holds together and works. That's the kind of things. It's like they just need to get around whatever it's a stage of the tour or whatever race it is, get around without having stupid stuff. It's beautiful seeing them in the spring classics, you know, things like if it's going to be raining, they're wearing a rain jacket and they're on the bike and they can't get it. It stopped raining and they can't get the jacket off because the cuff's too tight or the elastic's too tight. So they're yanking at it and they throw the jacket on the ground. Things like that. You have to, from a designer's point of view, when you put stuff together, solve those problems. That enables it. But how often is an amateur cyclist going to be yanking a jacket off them, you know, even for the team card? You know what I mean? So kind of it's
totally.
Like, yeah. So, but certainly there's things like that where there's a confluence of different things that happen, but certainly it's a very different market. The consumer market, again, is very different to that of the world of the pro riders. Yeah.
So you're talking about pro riders, which includes comfort, efficiency, durability. Let's talk about, you guys also sponsor like Australia Cycling, where watts are, you know, precious. And so that's a completely different animal there.
Yeah. That's very different. That's obviously, it's linked to the cycle that builds up to Olympic Games and kind of
track cycling,
and also kind of basically, well, yeah, track cycling predominantly, you could say, kind of drives a lot of the very dense kind of science behind what, let's just say, put it this way, makes cyclists move quicker on a bicycle. And there's very few suppliers, very few brands that are involved with that. I think even now, I wouldn't be wrong in saying that, let's put it this way, if you're not involved with one of the primary nations that's going to be competing, you know, say track at the Olympics, you're really not privy to what's going on in terms of that really raw technology that's going to come through. So like you said, yeah, we work with the Australians and have done for many years now, and they drive that science, they drive that technology, and definitely it's very, very interesting to see how that develops. But then again, on conversely, then it's really quite interesting. But again, there, if anybody, well, you know how the UCI has an implementation of certain rules and certain things that you have to find, almost like the game is trying to step around them and trying to find these shortcuts that are obviously still within the bounds of the regulations.
So it seems again, like kind of like Formula One almost.
Pretty much exactly what it is. You're kind of trying to figure stuff out in a way where obviously the athlete won't be disqualified as a result of you've made, you know, kind of a skin suit that's illegal in those terms. So I mean, a lot of it is very much based on that as well. But yeah, like I said, kind of leading now up to kind of the next Olympics, kind of we're going to see, hopefully, riders go quicker than they did before. That's the plan.
Hey, Fergus. Yeah, so we had a little bit of a technical difficulty at the last recording, but now we're back. And yeah, so what I wanted to talk about was kind of your experience of the brand Santini acquiring the contract of the Giro d'Italia, of the Tour de France, the yellow jersey, and all that came with it. And maybe if we could just run through that real quick.
Sure, no problem. Well, I guess that for who wouldn't know, that Santini's involvement in the Grand Tours existed, you could say, a long time ago, back in 1993 when we first took on the Giro d'Italia. And all but for a few years when it went back and forth to a few different other sponsors, we were consistently producing the Maglia Rosa for the Giro for RCS, which was, in fact, when I first moved over to Santini, that was pretty much my first job, was to design the Maglia Rosa. So kind of you're straight into the deep end, you could say. And from there, you see the mechanics of, I suppose, how it works, what it takes, all that's involved, not just, you could say, from a design point of view, but from the business end, is you're dealing with the entity that controls and owns the race, and all the sponsors that are involved with effectively supporting the race financially, and that is not necessarily simple. That's not a simple job.
And do you think that Santini, what you saw when you came into the situation was Santini had a lot of experience with that, and then that was what kind of helped make that machine kind of run smoothly?
So I guess at that point in time, yes. So from a pure production point of view, we have and had the know-how of how to produce a product. Because what you're doing fundamentally is you're creating, the product has to be equally as good as that of what the team will supply the potential winner of the race. So kind of, it's not just, you could say, as it is a symbol, but it's not just that. It has to actually function. That's your number one priority. Like the leader has to like to wear the jersey from a technical point of view,
and the speed suits.
Yeah, 100%. So there's all that kind of stuff involved. Then I suppose from after that, you look at the race, and what at that point in time, kind of 11 years ago now, the concept of merchandising, the concept of the explanation of what the brand was and how you could interpret that through product, through technical products, not just cheaper merchandise, but through the actual Maglia Rosa in that case, was coming to the front of everyone's minds. And so we not just the Maglia Rosa sticking with the Giro, but we were producing lines of clothing that were trying to open and explain the race, whether that was a specific area that the race would pass through, a specific climb, the history, a rider that won a stage, all that type of thing. And that comes back to storytelling and content expressed through a product, and then ultimately expressed through other means as well. So that was becoming.
And those are the stage jerseys, right? Where you guys do, I think it's between 4 and 5 commemorative stage kits, which allow consumers to be able to own a part of the jersey, own a part of the Giro, but with the top level technical fabrics and technical designs
Sure.
of the kit.
So the Maglia Rosa at that point, that did actually sell large quantities, and that primarily was the other classification jerseys to a lesser extent, but that did sell large quantities. But beyond that, it was a question of trying to convince them that, listen, there's so much here you can work with, that, we're a manufacturer. This is what we do. We produce technical apparel, and therefore we should try and put something together that incorporates everything. So the history, the apparel, and just the beauty of what is, or what was for us at that point, the Giro d'Italia.
And did you guys bring this concept forward to the Tour de France partnership then?
So I guess when Giro came to an end and going through into 2017, and we picked up the Vuelta, I guess, to kind of give people a bit of a background in terms of, kind of things change, and that's just the way business works. And then kind of it wasn't, kind of the best day in the office when, kind of we found out we weren't going to renew the contract with the Giro, but, you pick yourself up and you get going again. And from that point, we would look at it now as probably the best thing that ever happened, strangely enough. And that's when we picked up the Vuelta. And from the Vuelta was bought by ASO, so it became then under the wing of Unipublic in Spain, ASO in France. And they were really trying to regenerate that Grand Tour, that race. And they saw what we did with the Giro and being part of the plan of how they would do that. So with the Vuelta, you could say that was our entry into a business relationship with ASO.
Who own the Tour de France.
Correct, yeah, correct, exactly right. And from that point, I'll be very clear, no problem saying it. That was the key move to obtaining the contract for the Tour de France, was to demonstrate a level of trust and a level of commitment to what was at that point obviously a lesser race than the Tour, to work and try your best to make all that work. And then that led ultimately to the discussions that we had when we negotiated for the Tour de France. and that stood in our favor.
Awesome. And so now that you've got the tours, you guys are going on the second year of working with ASO on the Tour de France. Santini, just to be clear, Santini produces all of the leader jerseys.
Yep.
As well as there's so can you tell us about the current range for 2023?
Exactly. So kind of, yeah. So just again, so the contract was one for the Tour de France, and it was not just the Tour. It incorporates all the classics, all the one-day races, and the other stage races that fall under the umbrella of ASO. So there's Paris-Nice, Paris-Roubaix, Flèche, Liège, Paris Tour, Deutschland Tour, and there's and other races there as well. But all the L'Etape, all of those events, the mass participation events. So there was, we were negotiating for something that was, the Tour is as big as it gets, and kind of
Sure.
in terms of
Huge.
pure mechanics of the race itself, but how it works then from a production point of view. So then we have a lot of that is, we have to work. Paris-Roubaix in many people's eyes it's massive. Paris-Roubaix is a huge thing. So kind of we're there, like you said, off the back of the negotiations, and we demonstrated that we had the number one, production capacity, two, technical expertise to, like you say, produce the very highest quality, most, as you mentioned there, for example, the quick stuff, the speed suits. We knew how to do that better than anyone else, and that was critical for controlling keeping the riders happy. And then from the other end, we kind of, through, like I say, working with Vuelta and what we've done with the Giro previously, and in general, we'd shown that we had a capacity to translate the history and the culture of those events into products that would sell. So that led us then ultimately to kind of starting working with ASO. Yeah.
Cool. So since the day of recording looks like you just got back from Bilbao. So we're looking at we're a couple stages into the 2023 edition. So can you tell us a little bit about the range this year, just kind of an overview to let people know what to expect?
So like you mentioned before there, kind of one of the concepts is, aside from the replica jerseys we produce in the classification jerseys, one of the range that we put out there for the Tour, for example, is concentrated on, so you could have a number of what we call stage jerseys that are linked to the Grand Pas that was in Bilbao, and other key stages that ultimately the Tour has the right. The actual, it's clear, like they have the right to all of those, the history of what the Tour did before. So previously they'd never really exploited that. They'd never really tried to work with a partner that had the capacity, you could say, from a creative point of view or from a production point of view, been able to put that together for them. So for example, this year, there's different stages that would be, key stages in beautiful locations, or simply through the history of the Tour, we draw on all that stuff to create products. So I don't know, to give one example, there's the Puy de Dôme, famous climb that's going to, kind of be replicated again this year in Tour after many years. So simply creating, this instance, kind of a line of clothing, technical clothing that is in memory and champions this. And like I say, not necessarily cheap, in as much that it's not the lower end merchandise. It's more technical apparel that has to look good and be attractive, you could say, to a large spectrum of fans, but at the same time, it is typical Santini quality. So kind of, it's a higher quality product, and that's what we want to have out there from our point of view.
So for you to sit down and say, okay, I've got to make between 4 and 6 kits, like, is that fun for you? Is that pressure? Because it sounds like you have to sit down and say, okay, I have to look at all the stages. It feels like a pretty tall order, but I don't know. Can you walk me through what it's like when you first sit down on the paper? And
yes, this year was slightly. This year, for example, with the actual classification jerseys, I didn't have to go through the development and kind of all that stuff. So there was in essence slightly less work this year. So you could maybe a little bit more breathing space. But from, you could say, the creative end, you have to go through, obviously, the product is going to be launched prior to the Tour. Prior to the Tour, you somehow have to get information as regards what the course will be, and that can be difficult at times. So that's going to be information you have to tweak or eke out of individuals, so where it's going to happen, to give you time to design and develop it, to give you then time to sell it. So yeah, from that point of view, you kind of a lot can happen and come very quickly. So you have to be prepared for that. But I think from my point of view is that from a creative end, this, like you say, there's so much there. I mean, I love the history of cycling is one of the things that kind of I'm obsessed with, and kind of there's so much there that was never used before, and you're just kind of going, God, finally we can do something. So from my point of view, it was quite a pleasurable experience. You go through all the kind of the rigmarole of kind of presenting the stuff and kind of again, checking stuff over and kind of getting the sign off and all that kind of good stuff. But ultimately, they're very trustworthy and direct people to work with, and kind of I have a good working relationship. We all do with Santini with them, so they kind of they let us do our job, and so far that results in people buying the products, and that's what they're happy about.
Sure. I mean, it has to be sustainable for the brand, and it has to be sustainable for the organization. So it's sort of like you have to find that balance of something that is visually pleasing, that tells a story that will kind of maybe help word of mouth around the products. So in terms of so are you already working on next year, or when does that start?
So yeah, so basically at this point now, so obviously next year is going to be a huge event again with the race starting in Italy. So as of right now, over the course of the last 3 days, unfortunately, although we did do a lot of watching the bike race, but kind of and having fun, but a large part of it was meetings with ASO and meetings with the organizing committees that will be representing obviously Emilia Romagna, Toscana, and Piemonte from next year, along with different people, to discuss about what we're going to do. So from literally the jersey that will be, or the designs, that kind of concept that will be representing the Grand Depart is going to have to start basically within the end of this month. So kind of we're going to have to go through that entire process. So you work significantly in advance of the event itself. So we're going to get that going, and then like I say, there'll be a few other things now maybe for next year that probably can't talk about, but kind of there's going to be a few new things for next year, being the third year of the tour, and that's going to be cool kind of when they kind of get released as well.
Well, cool. Fergus, I really appreciate you taking the time with me. Thanks for coming on the second time, and I would love maybe another time we can get together and we can talk about what you see in the market, because I think you're really deep into it. So maybe next time we can talk about sort of the state of play in cycling clothing, because I know you're as deep into that as they get.
That's great. It'll be my pleasure. Thanks, Wade.
Okay, man.
Okay.
Thank
Chat
you.
soon. Ciao.